Okay, welcome to Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we're going to cover a couple of things. I'm going to talk about introduction to cybersecurity. I'm going to talk about basically cloud computing models, shared responsibility models, key cloud security principles, cloud security threats. We're going to get into identity access management, data protection strategies, network security in the cloud, compliance and legal issues, monitoring and incident response, and cloud security best practice. So let's talk about the introduction to cloud security. Cloud, cloud security really involves protecting data, applications, and services in a cloud environment. More businesses are moving to a cloud for obvious reason. Cost, I would say cost is a good piece of it. But also you don't have to maintain certain hardware resources that you normally would have to worry about in the past. Now, as you move to a cloud environment, there's some key concept around security you have to be aware of. The common theme, if you've been following my chapters, have been the CIA Triad, really confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information. There's various cloud models you could purchase. You could get what we call infrastructure as a service. You could get platform as a service as well as a software as a service. Now, each offering has a variation of security concerns you need to kind of be aware of. So if you think of infrastructure as a service, it's more of a virtualization of computer resources. Platform as a service is really around application development. And software as a service is really applications over the internet. Think of a lot of your subscription models. What I do recommend to students is go to AWS and spin up, one of these services. It's really cheap to do it, and it's a way for you to really learn about cloud computing and the shared responsibility that you have when you go to that platform. Again, I might have said it in other chapters. It's not a set it and forget it. You just don't give it away and just say, okay, my job is done. It is a shared responsibilities, and it's security impacts and concerns you need to be aware of as it relates to that. Hence why I said it's a shared responsibility model. It really delineates security obligation as it relates to the provider. The provider is really just providing you the platform for you to operate on. But it is a responsibility that you also have to share around, again, how are you going to secure that data as it relates to your applications and user access. They don't take accountability for that. It is a shared model. Just keep that in mind. There may be some questions around who's responsible for security, and they may give you an answer like it's totally the cloud provider's responsibility. It may say it's totally the customer responsibility, but remember, it's a shared responsibility model. Now, there's some key concepts you want to make sure you're aware of when you talk about how are you going to ensure the confidentiality and integrity and basically the availability of your information. Think of that from secure access controls. Now, one of the things that you want to make sure you're doing when you're doing this is you have regulations that you may need to comply with as it relates to how are you going to maintain that data and availability from a regulatory perspective. So what are some of those examples? GDPR is a good example of that. CCPA. Now, again, these are regulations that while we cover lightly in this course, I always tell individuals as they hear terms, you're never going to get all the terms in a training content. They'll throw those terms in, but it's really up to you to maybe dig in deeper because again, this is about what are the things I need to focus on for the examination. I am not necessarily teaching you how to be a cybersecurity practitioner. This is focused more on an exam. Now, there's a lot to this when it becomes how do I become a true practitioner? I will probably spin up some more courses related to that, but I'm really focusing on what are some of the things that you will see on the Security Plus examination and what are some of the concepts you have to be aware of from that perspective. Now, as you move into the cloud, obviously there's threats. There's breaches, there's data loss, there's hijacking, there's insecure APIs. Understanding these threats are really essential for really thinking through what is my cloud strategy? What are those security areas I need to be concerned with? If you remember looking at my previous chapters where I talk about risk management, this is really risk management. You have to assess the risk of moving data and your business into the cloud, understanding it's a shared responsibility where they may give you the house, I like to use, for you to live in, but you also are responsible for keeping those particular rooms that you are paying for within the house and the structure, keeping those rooms and the contents in those rooms safe. So what does that look like? You may have 3 locks. You may have a password authentication. You may not allow everybody into every single room. That is your decision. They're providing the security on the top, around the house, and they're going to make sure they have some layered security. But once inside, you're responsible for securing the contents of that room. I tend to use the house analogy a lot. Seems to resonate from that perspective. I talked about access. This is really identity access management, which is crucial for your security setup because it does involve multi-factor authentication, role-based controls, and privilege, what we call least privilege management, access to that asset, that data, that application. So again, earlier I used my analogy around multi-factor. I used the bank analogy where the banks, most banks, all banks, I would think these days, is not just going to allow you just to use your access password. So it may say, okay, what's your user ID? What's your password into the system? Then they may say, I'm going to send you a code because I want you to verify who you say you are. So then they're going to say, well, what do you have that I can send this information to? You could say, here's my phone, here's my email, you could call me, and they're going to give you whatever you say that is. Then at that point, you're going to get a code, you're going to get some mechanism, and then you're going to verify that back to the bank and say, yeah, this is who I am. In theory, that's really multi-factor authentication. It's multiple verification of access to gaining entry into an application, into a software, into a platform. Building upon that, you have role-based access. So really, you don't give access to everyone in your organization. What you want to do is give them the access they need to do their role. Another good example, you have a payroll system, and then you have a payroll administrator. That payroll administrator may only administer payroll for the accounting department. They don't do it for the marketing department. They don't do it for any other department. So you'll put in place multi-factor, and then you'll make sure that that individual, when they sign in, they only have access to the accounting department because their role is to do payroll for the accounting department. It is not to do payroll for other areas within your business. That ties then back into principle of least privilege in terms of how you provide that access point to that application. You always want to make sure you're not giving access to everyone in the organization. You want to give them the least amount of privilege they need to do to gain access to what they need to do. You're going to hear this concept of zero trust, and that's a whole other conversation in itself. Zero trust, I do subscribe to that. I think now there's some overhead to it, don't get me wrong, but I do believe that trust nobody and always verify, re-verify, because you just never know. But again, that's a little bit more far advanced than what I want to cover in this course here. So I talked about access. Now you have to think through your strategy around your data in the cloud. How do you want to make sure your data sits within the environment? How is it going to be transferred? What are your encryption keys? Do you need backup? What happens if the data is gone or my system's gone? Now, am I able to bring it back? I had a disaster. And then you want to ensure secure deletion of your information. So that ties back into what's your retention policy? What data are you required to keep? I think payroll data you have to keep 7 or 8 years. There's other data, HIPAA, etc. So you want to make sure you have a good data protection strategy as you move into the cloud. I said it's a shared responsibility. Again, they'll give you the ecosystem to kind of operate in. I use my house analogy, but you're responsible for various components within that room that you have to worry about. They're not going to worry about it again. And if you read through everything, they actually do call that out. And I think sometimes companies get into the mindset of, well, it's in the cloud, set it and forget it. It's not necessarily always the case. Even if you think about when you back up your phone, your data into the cloud, there's some preliminary questions that they do ask you in terms of, well, how long do you want to keep it? And you can say forever, but they're going to charge you for it. So you have to even have a strategy for where you want your information backed up to. So again, that's really the whole concept around data protection strategy. Obviously, there's a definition, but I try to explain it to you in a way that you could kind of resonate in terms of what this shared responsibility really means from that. Continuing on that, let's get into the network security in the cloud. So again, you want to secure your virtual networks. So just like I talked about network access security, this is more, again, tying back into tools that you will be able to gain access to within the shared environment. You still got to configure it. So whether you're running your own network in your home, meaning you bought 5 or laptops, or you bought 5 desktops and you configuring it in your home, you still will have firewall configurations. You want to create intrusion detections and prevention detection configuration. And you also may want to set up a secure VPN to protect those data sources. So again, the same concept applies. You're just doing it in a cloud environment with tool sets that have been provided by the cloud provider. When you think of when you're moving to the cloud, now you get into some regulatory concerns. Again, I talked to you about GDPR. I talked to you about HIPAA. There's different cloud frameworks that you could look into to help you guide that through. You will have legal issues related to data residency and sovereignty, which must be also considered. Meaning, if you're running a e-commerce store and you are actually gathering data and you're not using some other provider, meaning if you are selling into the US, you're selling in Ireland, you're selling in, let's say, Asia Pac, you do have to be concerned where you are storing that data. I could tell you in my day-to-day life as a cybersecurity professional, I'm always working with compliance and legal to figure out, okay, how long do we have to retain this data? Can we bring the data over? Who is the data owner, data processor? it really, you sometimes have to get into the level of detail to ensure you are operating in a manner that's in alignment with regulations according to where your business operates and where your business does not operate. There are fines, there's heavy penalties if you don't follow those guidelines. As always, you want to monitor and have a good incident response plan in the cloud. Same difference as I talked to you about in previous chapters. You want to continuously monitor for tools, again, that will be provided to you by normally the provider. Like I said, AWS is really a good one. I go in there and I tinker all the time, and I set up an S2 bucket. I'll set up user access controls. I'll set up firewalls. Again, it just kind of keeps me fresh and aware of what's out there. So then, as I'm advising my current client on various things as it relates to cyber, at least I understand how that environment is operating, and I'm able to recommend different strategies for that perspective. And of course, you have here performing forensic analysis are crucial for managing security incidents in the cloud. So that really ties into your, what we call our cyber operational center, our SOC, where you're pulling logs. And when you get into the field of cyber, that's a good entry point into the business where you are looking and reviewing logs, you're doing forensic on it, and then you're making a determination whether you have a potential issue or you don't have a potential issue. But that's where that piece comes into play. So what are the best practices? Really, you want to make sure that you're always doing a risk assessment. If you see anything on a question, the first thing, if you see is risk assessment, that's normally the answer. You never jump in and you start just doing stuff. You gotta assess where you're at and able to prove out your next steps. What are your critical areas of risk? How are you going to remediate from that perspective? The other thing is you have to stay informed. Stay informed by understanding emerging threats and making sure that you are proactive by training your employees, your staff, as it relates to the cloud. That is key. Okay? So again, focusing on some questions you might see on the exam. What is cloud computing? List 3 key principles of cloud security. Why is it important to evaluate the security measures of a cloud service provider? What is the shared responsibility model in cloud security? Again, I try to at least give you a version of an answer. The answer on the questionnaire might be multiple choice, but understanding the definition of a question as to what is cloud security is, that will help you. So cloud, obviously, computing refers to the delivery of computing services over the internet, allowing users to access and store data on a remote server rather than a local device. Again, that's kind of a textbook definition. That's something I would just make myself familiar with and understand. If you see a question related to it, normally that'll be the answer. What are the key principles? Again, encryption, access control, data privacy. Why is it important to evaluate the security measures of cloud security providers? Again, it's important to evaluate the security measures of the security provider to ensure they're adhering to industry best practice and standards. That's important. This will help protect against sensitive data, ensure that potential vulnerabilities are addressed. For most of them, I would think you would have no problem. I haven't run across a cloud provider that didn't adhere to some of these principles. But remember, it is a shared responsible model. So again, what is the shared responsible model in the cloud security? The shared responsibility model in a cloud security outlines the division of security responsibility between the cloud provider and the customer. That's very important. It ensures that both parties understand their roles and maintain the security of the cloud environment. So it's important for you to know what they're going to do and what you're responsible for. Glossary of terms, as usual, my recommendation, just know what they are, know the definition, study that. cloud computing, encryption, access control, study those definitions. Data privacy, again, understanding what that is. Shared responsibility model, study these definitions. Okay, so this concludes chapter 4 from that perspective. So again, along with the video that is accompanying this, my kind of narrative around this, hopefully you get a better understanding of some of these key components. But as I say always, practice exams are key, but at least if you start out with what I provided and you start to do the practice exams, you will start to get a feel of how to answer it from that perspective. But as usual, as always, please reach out to me on my website if you have any questions for anything that I've covered in my training, or you might just say, hey, here's an opportunity to improve. I'm always looking for feedback. I always tell everyone, nobody's perfect. It's not a one and done. We could all improve in anything we do from that perspective. Okay, thank you.